Welcome back to the Knife Studio. I hope you've had a very Merry Christmas and that you're gonna have an awesome, prosperous, new year of 2020. The stiletto project is finally finished and I can get back to working on the hunter that I started a couple of months ago and had to set it aside and work on these other projects. I'm gonna go back in time to 2 projects ago. We worked on the stiletto, and then before that was this fighter right here. When I made the fighter, I forged the damascus for this hunter at the same time and went all the way through the heat treating stage and everything, and then broke off and just worked on the fighter instead of working on both projects. So what we've done with this hunter so far is forged the tight feather pattern damascus and rough forged the blade, rough ground the blade, heat treated, tempered, and did a lot of the final grinding on the blade. I've also done the performance testing with the blade. It chopped through the 2x4 and shaved really well. Big old gnarly knot we went through, so it passed that part of the test as well. I'm gonna jump right into doing the final bits of grinding, and then we can start hand sanding this blade. So let's get to it. I'm gonna grind on the plunge area and get those cleaned up first. So I've got a nice straight scribe line going across here that I can use as a reference on each side. I got all the final grinding done on the hunter, and it's time to start doing some hand sanding. So I'm gonna go through with 320 grit and then probably a 600 grit. And after that, we can move on to grinding in the clip and putting my maker's mark on and stuff like that. But first, coffee break. It's kind of burnt. As I'm hand sanding on this plunge cut area, I want to be really careful with the sandpaper wrapped around my file when I get up to it to keep the file flat and parallel to the edge bevel. I don't want it to tip up like this as I'm kind of sanding up that little radius, because as you do that for a while, if it tips up like this, it'll slowly be eating away a little trench right here, and there'll be like a little low spot in your blade. I got the blade hand sanded to 600 grit. I also went ahead and domed the spine so it's got a little bit of a radius on it, and then I used EDM stones on that and got it up to about 600 grit as well. I ground in the clip and sanded that. I also ground in this choil area down here and got that sanded up to 1500 grit. And right now, I've got layout on the ricasso where my maker's mark goes, and I'm getting ready to take this stencil and etch my maker's mark, electrochemically etch it into the ricasso, nice and deep, so I'll have a clear mark on my blade that says I made it. It says I'm a mastersmith. These stencils are a little hard to see through. They're kind of translucent, but it helps if you have a bunch of light directly shining through the stencil, and then I'll be able to see my Sharpie layout underneath. It's really important to get the stencil perfectly centered and square on the ricasso, otherwise your maker's mark is going to be permanently in the blade, crooked or off center. Now that I've got the stencil taped on, we'll go ahead and electrochemically etch the maker's mark through the stencil. I'm going to use my homemade Variac controller to do this electrochemical etching. Before we do that, the sponsor of the week is the online Bowie knife course by my family and yours truly. If you're interested in seeing how I etch my maker's mark in, where I get the stencil, how I make my electrochemical etcher, and go through it all step by step, then click the link below and you'll have access for free to one of the videos from the course that goes in depth on how I do my maker's mark etching. So check that out in the link below, and you'll definitely learn something about how to etch in a maker's mark electrochemically. And now back to our regularly scheduled broadcast. I've got the stencil laid out on here, so I want to remove the Sharpie because it can actually inhibit the mark from etching properly. It can kind of act as a resist, and it might leave a weird line all the way through your marks. You want to remove that with some acetone before you start etching the mark in. We're going to hook one electrode to the tang, and one I'm going to hook to this metal. We're going to put felt on it, and then put some electrolyte to help the electricity go through and make contact with the metal easier. This is just a chunk of mild steel that I use to fasten the felt to, and the electricity can flow through it. And then I'm just using some super cheap Walmart felt. It's like the, I don't know, like 15, 20 cents a sheet kind. And I like to just rubber band it on. I'm gonna use some electrolyte and soak it down pretty well. You wanna have just the right amount on there though, so I like to get it really wet and then kind of dab some of the moisture out with a paper towel. I've etched it for about 5 minutes, and I think we're down to the depth it needs to be, so let's go ahead and take the stencil off and take a look at how it looks. Now I'm going to darken my mark with some brass black. Got the mark darkened up, so I'm going to go ahead and sand over it and really get a good idea of how it looks after we clean up all the smudges around it. There it is, all finished up with a 1500 grit finish on the ricasso. It's nice and deep. So I want to show you something here. I actually didn't put the maker's mark square on the ricasso on purpose. You can see that it's ever so slightly tipped forward up at the top towards the spine of the blade. And I also have my plunge line tipped forward ever so slightly, and then back here where the guard is gonna fit up against the ricasso, it's also tipped forward ever so slightly. The reason I like it tipped forward ever so slightly is because if it was tipped backwards, just a little bit like this, your eye would look at it and think the knife looks really slow and just something looks wrong. If it's perfectly square, the knife will look faster and just look more proper when your eye sees it and your brain processes it. And I tip it forward ever so slightly because it kind of subtly hints at your brain that it's a fast moving knife when it's something it can't even really perceive, but subconsciously you might pick up on it. If you guys want more tips like that on how I get my mark electrochemically etched into my blades, then check out that link in the description. I've got the guard fit onto the hunter blade. It looks integral. It fits so well. I'm working on the pattern right now for the handle. I'm repurposing this. I already ground down on it. This is just in my stash of patterns from a buoy or fighter I'd made in the past. The reason I'm repurposing it instead of making a new one is just because it was almost the exact shape I was wanting. It was just too large. So I'm getting this pretty much the right size as my handle. The reason I need the pattern is because this is going to be a frame handle. So you're just going to have the ivory on each side of the tang, and then to fill it in and make it look like a full tang, there's going to be metal pieces in there. So I need a pattern so I can drill the holes in the right pieces and have all the holes line up with the frame pieces and the handle material pieces. And you might ask, Kyle, what's up? Bro, why don't you just do a full tang and skip the whole frame handle thing? And there's a good explanation for that, because with the full tang, you can't do this kind of hidden tang guard fit up and everything. And I also want the tang to be a different material than the blade. It's gonna be steel, so it can be engraved on and gun blued instead of damascus. And the handle is gonna be a takedown assembly. The scales will be pinned to the frame, so all the pieces won't come apart, but I will be able to take the handle assembly off and do any kind of maintenance or anything on it in the future if it needs that. Well, I got the guard fit on nice and tight, and then I moved on to working with the mammoth ivory for this knife, and I've also got the frame roughed out. It's actually closer than rough. It's pretty close to the final shape. I'm working on getting the tang threaded right now, so I've got it ground down. I need to normalize the end of the tang so I can thread it a little easier, and then we can move on to actually threading it. So we're going to normalize the end of the tang by heating it up to about 1500 degrees, so it'll be a lot softer. It'll still be a little one. Really important to get the heat down into the ricasso because we don't want that transition where the tang goes to the ricasso to be really hard. We want that springiness to go all the way into the ricasso so we don't break the tang off right here, having a stress point there. So I draw those colors down, but be careful not to get the edge of the blade heated up past like a straw color for sure. Just let this cool and then we can start trying to cut threads in there. Back. Oh. I got the tang all threaded up with our 1032 thread. So the next thing I want to do is start working on the pommel and get a hole drilled in that and get a chunk of steel cut off for the pommel and start making the pommel nut. I kind of do the pommel and pommel nut at the same time because I got to get just the right size hole in the pommel for the pommel nut, depending on where I'm going with that. This is symbol for Atlantis. It's the 7th? 9th. It's the 9th chevron.